of multicultural harmony. To make such a sacrifice, we're repeatedly told, is only reasonable. Indeed, a couple of years ago, when a coalition of Dutch politicians, educators, business leaders, and Christian and Muslim clergy announced their intention to try to exclude Geert Wilders from public debate because of his criticism of Islam, they actually described themselves as, quote, reasonable people. It was interesting to note that when the so-called Muslim intellectual Tariq Ramadan, who among much else has refused to condemn the stoning of adulteresses, was appointed to a chair at a major Dutch university, none of these reasonable people said a word about it. This was no surprise because it has long since become clear that as far as Europe's reasonable people are concerned, Orthodox Muslims who are openly and actively working to achieve the full Islamization of the West are to be invited into the tent, just as long as they claim to reject attaining this goal through violence. I'm speaking of people like Mohammed Usman Rana, who has been welcomed into the pages of Aftenposten, Norway's newspaper of record, as a regular columnist, even though he has categorically refused to reject the death penalty for homosexuals. Meanwhile, those who criticize people like Rana routinely find themselves being harassed, insulted, misrepresented, and demonized in the same media organs that welcome the views of men like him. I live in Norway, which is a small country of 4.5 million people. But precisely because it is so small, it serves as a useful microcosm of what's going on throughout Western Europe. I've quoted this before, but I'll quote it again because it's so insanely and disturbingly typical of the kind of attitude I'm talking about. Back in 2001, confronted with the fact that 65% of the rapes in Norway were committed by quote-unquote non-Western immigrants, which is the Norwegian euphemism of choice for Muslims, Uni Vikan, one of Norway's leading Islam experts, said that, quote, Norwegian women must take their share of responsibility for these rapes because Muslim men find their manner of dress provocative. Norwegian women, she maintained, must realize that we live in a multicultural society and adapt to it. Her words. Then there is novelist Dag Solstad, a major literary figure in Norway, who last year in a highly publicized speech argued that free speech is actually undesirable since it drowns meritorious works, such as his novels, presumably, in a sea of vulgarity, a category to which he relegated the Danish cartoons. The former head of the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation agreed with him, complaining in an op-ed about how the Western world has made free speech sacred. He found it scary, his words, scary, that some people might actually fight for the right to speak their minds. The world is changing, he insisted. It always has been. Sacred things come and go. In other words, freedom is a fad. Shake it off, move on. In recent months, attacks on freedom by the Norwegian elite have only intensified. First, there was a serious attempt to strengthen the blasphemy law. More recently, there have been calls to rewrite the Norwegian constitution to include multicultural protections for the rights of groups, a change which would involve setting limits on debate and punishing those who offend religious sensibilities. A leading Oslo publisher has suggested that we should, quote, let go of the idea that our hard-won right to offend, wound, and insult our fellow man is a good thing. Jan Erik Smilden, a former Middle East correspondent for the newspaper Dagbladet, has written that, quote, free speech is an important principle, but it has its limits. In recent years, that same sentiment has been expressed in the Western media by a long list of leading cultural figures. So intense is the pressure to take such positions that it wasn't until he was diagnosed with terminal cancer that the environmental activist Steinar Lem, one of Norway's most outspoken left-wing intellectuals, dared to publicly address the threat that the growth and appeasement of fundamentalist Islam in Norway poses to values like sexual equality, respect for gay people, and the right to criticize religion. This man, who had always seemed a fearless advocate of the causes closest to his heart, admitted that he hadn't spoken up earlier for one reason, and one reason alone. He was scared of alienating his fellow environmentalists and intellectuals. That was last April. Steinar Lem died 3 weeks later. Excuse me for talking so much about Norway, but it's a country that I've come to love. It has become my home, and it's chilling to see it destroying itself. In any case, multiculturalism has reaped what it sowed. The killer of Theo van Gogh was born and bred in Amsterdam. London's 7/7 terrorists were, as the media put it, British lads. Is it any surprise that the children and grandchildren of immigrants, young people raised in a society suffused with a multicultural disdain for its own liberties, tell pollsters in staggeringly high numbers that they would like to see Sharia law in Europe? After all, the people whose lessons about the world they've taken in over the years in mosques and religious schools and Islamic community centers, the people they've read on Islamist websites and watched on Al Jazeera and other satellite channels, know what they believe in and stand for. The Al-Qaradawis of the world aren't relativists. They aren't multiculturalists. They have a goal and a vision and a determination and a sense of identity and values that Western multiculturalists do not. And they know it, and therein lies their strength. Since 9/11, there have been a number of moments of truth. But in my view, the episode of the Danish cartoons was perhaps the critical moment for the struggle of freedom in the West against Islam and its multicultural appeasers and enablers. I'm sure most of you are familiar with at least the outlines of the story. After an editor at the Danish newspaper Jyllandsposten learned that illustrators in his country were scared to draw pictures of Muhammad for an innocuous children's book, he solicited and published drawings of Muhammad by a dozen different cartoonists. Thanks to a concerted international effort by Danish Muslim leaders who were determined to pressure the Danish government into apology and appeasement, the cartoons gained the attention of the world. And in a vivid demonstration of the fact that the appeasement of Islam is not an exclusively left-wing or right-wing phenomenon, the cartoons were condemned by both Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. Both the Washington Post and New York Times on the left and the Wall Street Journal on the right, both The Nation and the National Review, and both Fox News and CNN refused to reprint them, whether out of solidarity with their colleagues at Jyllandsposten or simply in order to show the public what all the fuss was about. In fact, only one major newspaper in the entire United States ran the cartoons, the Philadelphia Inquirer, while here in Canada, they were published only in the Jewish Free Press and the Western Standard, both of which were reported to the Alberta Human Rights Commission for doing so. In Europe, to their credit, a few major newspapers reprinted the cartoons, though in all of Britain, not a single newspaper did so. In Norway, the editor of a tiny Christian newspaper reprinted them, but after a couple of weeks of extreme pressure by people